Our first speaker is Professor Neil Harris, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Neil, the Preston and Sterling Morton Professor in the Department of History and the college. Neil took his BA from Columbia and his PhD from Harvard, came straight here from Harvard, well, that's the right choice, and has been a mainstay of the history department ever since. One of the founders of cultural history and the history of culture, Neil is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, former board member of the ACLS and the National Museum of American History, and a current board member of the Newberry Library and the Terra Foundation. He's written 7 monographs, edited 3 or 4 more books, I kind of lost count, I'm sorry to say, and has pioneered whole areas of cultural history. I will say this, I first heard Neil give a talk in the 1970s, giving a mesmerizing talk about the history of malls. I was captivated by it, and I've been a huge fan of Neil's ever since. I'm very much looking forward to his perspective on Regenstein, which he has known very well from the date it was imagined. Neil?
It's very nice to be here, and thank you, Andy, for those generous remarks. As we envisage the future of our library, it may be useful to indulge in what is actually family history, reviewing creation of what we already have. The history and the story of our libraries have been well described in exhibition and narrative form, particularly by Daniel Meyer, the university archivist, and I'm indebted to Dan and to Special Collections for the images that you'll soon be seeing. But the details of Regenstein's creation are not as widely known as they should be. Its opening 35 years ago was the critical linchpin in the reconstruction of this university after some decades of challenge. Planning and building it were acts of faith and assumptions of risk. We are no smarter than our predecessors, and we will make our own mistakes as they made theirs. But my broadest conclusion is that if we achieve as much success for our project as the planners of Regenstein did for theirs, we will have managed very well. And when I say planners, while many were involved, one person above all others got this structure built, got it built where it stands, and got it built in its final form. That was Herman Fussler, the director. I spent time this summer, a small amount of time to be sure, going through his papers and on reviewing the mass of reports, correspondence, studies, consultations, manifestos, promotional appeals, and commentaries produced over several decades before this building opened. I came away with great respect for his lengthy, highly personal, and ultimately victorious campaign to build a great central library reflecting the aspirations of this institution. And this is really where I begin my historical study. The search for a physical structure to house what had suddenly become, in the 1890s, the 5th largest university library in the United States, emerged as a major theme during the university's first 20 years. A celebrated, much described, and flamboyant gesture, the purchase of 175,000 books from a German dealer, the so-called Berlin collection, when added to the materials inherited from the first University of Chicago, created an important, if uneven, nucleus for scholarly research. The 1890s saw 2 important library buildings created for this city, the Chicago Public, today's Cultural Center, and the Newberry. But no major library building was planned here, both for financial and for intellectual reasons. Scientists wanted their laboratories and museums, humanists and social scientists their seminar rooms with ready access to specialized collections. And for many decades, they opposed vigorously the centralizing efforts of librarians, administrators, and some of their colleagues, fighting with an intensity unsurprising to students of academic warfare. In any event, despite occasional hints at massive building plans, this picture is labeled the first University of Chicago library, but it doesn't go any further than that, so I'm showing it to you. The library spent 10 years in a temporary structure on the site of what is now Hutchinson Commons, sharing space with the gymnasium and a bookstore in the University of Chicago Press. And this begins the interesting relationship between the library and athletic pursuits at this institution. While plans were made for a massive athletic building, that's the large building on the left, I think it's on the left, there were none for a library. And in 1902, the library was moved to the newly created University Press building on 58th and Ellis. And you can see it on the left of your screen. This is a lithograph from about 1906. Here it would remain for another 10 years, supplemented by collections in Cobb, and these are purportedly photographs of the library when it existed in Cobb, and later in Haskell. President Harper feared, and here you can see a view in Haskell and a contemporaneous illustration from Scribner's of university students. President Harper feared in that first decade that fire might reduce the entire collection to ashes in a single night, and he had hopes for a large new building. It was, in fact, Harper's death and the need to provide a suitable memorial that stimulated a $600,000 library gift from John D. Rockefeller, supplemented by other donations that produced eventually the $1 million Harper Memorial Library and construction of our southern flank. Before turning to Regenstein, it's important to say a few things about Harper, not only because it was our central library for 58 years, but because its glaring deficiencies constituted a warning about the consequences of physical planning, an unhappy revelation of just how things could go very wrong. Not that Harper wasn't and isn't beautiful. The entries, the facade, the reading rooms were, as you know, those of you who know this campus, adorned with sculpted references to the university's mission, to the power of print, and to collegial institutions. The elegantly detailed main reading room, here are the east and west screens, remains a powerful presence on campus. This was a monument, moreover, equipped with what, at the time at least, was the latest technology. This is sort of technical services at an early date. Moreover, the library was expected to be part of a vast multi-building complex. This had been the plan ever since 1902. Here you can see an early version of the library with a central tower, and then a slightly later version of it totally interconnected. History and social sciences to the east, humanities, including classics, to the west, theology and the law school to the north, all connected by tunnels and bridges, a compromise really between a central and departmental library scheme. Originally, the first two floors under the main reading room were to be filled with stacks to house the growing collections, and here are plans of what that library group might look like. Plans and reality, of course, did not match. It took 17 years more for the two adjacent structures, Wiebolt and Social Sciences, to be completed. This is Harper, of course, when it was finished, and again, a building not yet connected. Not all the bridge connections were made, the floors below the reading room were employed for offices, and the narrow footprint of the building, plus the difficulties of expansion, intensified issues of book delivery, communication, and movement through the structure as a whole. Despite the almost immediate openings of Classics and Rosenwald, each of which contained additional stack space, within a decade after its ceremonial opening, Harper was deemed impossibly overcrowded. Despite the high ambitions of its architect, Charles Coolidge of Coolidge and Hodgson, planners of much of the main campus, Harper was something of a professional failure. When it opened, its capacity stood between 500 and 600,000 volumes. But university collections already were approaching 500,000 volumes. By 1924, a dozen years later, half our books were housed in departmental libraries. Harper certainly possessed attractive features. Members of the humanities and social science faculties by the 1930s could walk from their offices indoors to the library. There were special reading rooms created for departmental graduate students. That's history on the top and philosophy under it. And this notion, in fact, has returned to present discussions. The building had enormous charm in addition to its outstanding physical proximity to classes and offices. Here on the bottom, a view of the rare book reading room, and on the top, the poetry room. During this period, because of wealthy philanthropists, the university made impressive additions to its collections in a range of areas, maintaining its position as the fifth largest university library in this country. During the late 1920s, moreover, the first professional librarian to be appointed director arrived from Johns Hopkins, M. Llewellyn Rainey, and the Graduate Library School would soon be established. But from the 1920s on, the library's unhappy limitations would produce a 45-year-long series of commissions, committees, proposals, and appeals for a better solution. These were years after Harvard's Widener and when Butler Library at Columbia and Sterling at Yale would be constructed with large capacities, when state university libraries in Minneapolis, Berkeley, Ann Arbor, Madison, and Champaign-Urbana would grow their collections vigorously, and when, during the Depression and the war, the University of Chicago seemed helpless to arrest a decline in library budgeting and quality. In the early 20s, a commission on the future policy of the libraries was established, consisting of faculty and trustees in response to the perceived crisis. Remember, this is 10 years after Harper opened. It came up with two diametrically opposed views: a decentralized, department-oriented system favored by many faculty, especially the scientists, and a new central library. Coolidge and Hodgson drew up plans for a new building just opposite Harper. You can see this plan on the left, creating a library court, redoing Haskell and the law school. But in classic fashion, the divided commission voted to postpone action on either proposal, unable to reach consensus. In 1930, another effort was made, and then the Depression ended further action. Remedial steps were taken, new stack areas built, some efficiencies introduced, and then came the war. So the only way, about 1950 or so, or after that, that the university could receive more books was to get rid of old ones. A dual strategy was adopted: sending an increasing number of books to the newly created Midwest Interlibrary Center, today's Center for Research Libraries, and microfilming as much as possible. And this is a view of the early microfilm project. Director Fussler admitted that both of these were limited short-term strategies. He had joined the staff in 1936, coming from the New York Public Library, heading the microphotography office there, and he became director in 1948, a low ebb in the library's fortunes. Nevertheless, he began to argue immediately that something had to be done. Around 1949 or 50, soon after Herman Fussler's appointment and creation of still another faculty trustee committee, this one headed by Paul Harper, the president's son, a few architectural plans were drawn up for a new central library, either in traditional Gothic dress, as in these renderings by William Alderman, or in modern garb. You chose whichever you wanted. One immense structure would arouse particular faculty ire. And that's Obata and Blair on the left and a rendering by Chester Danforth on the right. These were planned for the site occupied by the tennis courts facing University Avenue at 58th Street. This area was to be filled in, balancing the newly created and unbeautiful administration building on the quadrangle's western edge. Meanwhile, Herman Fussler had developed a fascinating, very detailed scheme, which he eagerly shared with an ongoing multi-university Committee on Library Building Plans, where he was characteristically active. In December 1949, he and William Alderman presented to a meeting in Ann Arbor several floors of a proposed 400,000 square foot library, with some interesting anticipations and some interesting differences with what would be developed 15 years later. Within a year of his appointment, Herman Fussler had designed a new library. He was ready to move, but no one else was. As Fussler noted, despite the appointment of ongoing trustee committees on library development beginning in 1947, the development program was not coordinated and there seemed little commitment to the task. University fundraising campaigns did not feature library needs. I think it fair to say, Fussler wrote in 1956, that until at least the last year or two before he resigned, Mr. Hutchins was not convinced that major new library construction was a matter of critical importance to the current and future well-being of the university. I think he may have had this conviction when he left, but I am not positive. Fussler recalled two major efforts to get money for a new library, one from Cyrus Eaton, the Cleveland industrialist who was a university trustee, and the other from the Kresge Foundation. Neither was successful. During the 1950s, or its first half, Chancellor Kimpton's attention was absorbed by other matters, the neighborhood and urban renewal in particular. Fussler continued to write memoranda, issue warnings, appeal for faculty support, and urge the trustees to pay concentrated attention to the need for a new facility and for a larger, better-paid staff. His statistical evidence and logic were both compelling, his rhetoric sometimes eloquent, but neither got far. The decline of the library relative to other institutions was now absolutely clear, and the overcrowded, outdated facility was something of an embarrassment for recruitment purposes. By the late 50s, the university's library expenditures had slipped to 20th among American universities, and the library size itself in danger of slipping out of the first 10. Lawrence Kimpton did at last recognize the gravity of the problem, and in 1959-60, a Chicago architectural firm, Pace Associates, was employed to consider various proposals to meet the library's problems. One which they were quite enthusiastic about involved a $5.5 million reconstruction, retaining Harper, but adding to the building's north frontage, practically doubling its thickness, taking down Haskell, and constructing a new building there connected to Harper. Essentially, this would double the building's capacity. The second possibility, which cost twice as much and which appealed far more to Herman Fuster, would create a completely new building, presumably on the tennis court site, although other possibilities were mentioned. Pace Associates said both were viable options, but again, no decision was made, and the university budget remained tight. The big shift, the immediate background to Regenstein, comes with the arrival of George Beadle as president in 1961 and the simultaneous appointment of Edward Levy as provost. The Beadle-Levy duo, with Herman Fuster and trustee Gaylord Donnelly, became in effect the promotional team, making a new central library an essential component for their vision of the future. It's the 1960s that sees, as I suggested earlier, the reinvention of the University of Chicago, the stabilization of the neighborhood, the beginning of a return to financial solvency, a decision to mount a large capital fund drive, and new ambitions for rebuilding and enlarging both faculty and student body. A special trustees committee, this time headed by Gaylord Donnelly, was appointed and became actively involved. And this was when Herman Fuster and his allies engaged in extensive lobbying of the faculty to cultivate support for the idea of a new central library, to design its program, and to restart the endless and apparently fruitless quest for funds to build it. Everything comes together in the years 1962 to 1965. In 1962, the trustees and the committee of the council formally commit to creation of a new central library, and the history of what would 8 years later become Regenstein begins. The Regenstein plans, conceptual and architectural, and the fundraising campaign basically occupy the years 62 to 65. 1963-64 were particularly active and intense. We're basically talking about something created 40 years ago. Remember that people had been thinking about a new library for 40 years already by this time, and Herman Fuster had been drawing up provisional plans since at least 1949. His interest was creating a library primarily for the research needs of faculty and graduate students. I might point out that in the autumn of 1964, the College of the University of Chicago contained 2,146 students, fewer than half the present enrollment. The Humanities and Social Science divisions, plus graduate education and the Graduate Library School, contained more than 1,900. The university had just 6,900 students total, although it was projected optimistically to rise to more than 10,000 within 10 years, including 4,000 graduate students. But the creation of the detailed program, the selection of the architects, the choice of an actual site, and the specific disposition of this building all develop in a 30-month period, starting in the early fall of 1962, when Fuster and university architect J. Lee Jones set about searching for the architectural firm to design the building. It was a somewhat different process then. It had begun in broad fashion the year before. When he started thinking about architects in early 1961, Fuster reluctantly agreed to work, if necessary, with Eero Saarinen, who was the university's planning architect and the designer of the law school. But Herman Fuster had many objections to the law school library. Saarinen's untimely death in the fall of '61 made the issue moot, and a series of famous names surfaced in discussions, including Philip Johnson, who would soon be designing the Bobst Library at NYU, and Louis Kahn of Philadelphia, a fascinating possibility. But in the end, the focus was on architects with experience designing large research libraries. This was not a committee. This was Herman Fussler, aided by the university architect. In late 1962, Fussler and Jones visited 4 firms, ending up recommending 3 to the Board of Trustees. Murphy and Mackey of St. Louis, who had done the recent Olin Library at Washington University and the Climatron for the St. Louis Botanical Gardens, Warner Burns, Tone and Lunde of New York, designers of the new Cornell and Brown University libraries, and a few years later of the University of Toronto's Robarts Library. If you want to see what an alternative to Regenstein might have looked like, this is one, because in fact the capacities resemble one another. Fussler's first choice, however, was Skidmore, Owings, Merrill of Chicago, Walter Netsch in particular, creators of the Queer Library at IIT, the University of Illinois Chicago campus and its library, and the Northwestern University Library, along with the Air Force Academy in Colorado. Each visit to the architects produced a careful assessment of the competing firms' special capacities and incapacities, and various other characteristics. It was, in my view, a model search, carefully documented, with comments from various outside experts on their experiences with these architects, along with shrewd observations by Herman Fussler. He was not uncritical of Walter Netsch's work, observing that the architect needed to be supervised closely, but he valued his previous library designs. He wanted a Chicago-based architect, and he found particularly impressive SOM's desire to work closely on the programming of the building. Netsch would work with architectural colleagues William Hartman, William Dunlap, and Ralph Youngren especially. Whether Fussler ever came to regret the decision is unclear, although there were tensions as Fussler tried to wean Netsch away from his heavy reliance on the Northwestern plan, which Fussler considered unsuitable for this library. Recall that until this point, it had been assumed the new library would be constructed on the site of the tennis courts at 58th and University, another of these, again, athletic connections. And I show you some scenes from the 1890s. Tennis had been played there now for some 70 years. However, it quickly became apparent by mid-63 to Fussler and the architects that they could not build a 3 million volume library of almost 500,000 square feet in the central quadrangles. Even without the science collections, it would either have to be too tall, marring the quadrangles, or have too many of its operations below grade. Parking and delivery would be difficult, future expansion expensive. Harper demonstrated the folly of risking and accepting an inadequate footprint. So in October 1963, Fussler, risking dissent within the alliance he had built up by countering continuing opposition to a central library with reassurance that at least it would be near faculty offices and classrooms, he went to a joint meeting of the board of the library and the library committee and asked them to endorse the move to Stagg Field. They did so. Professor Robert Grant of the Divinity School, Fussler reported wryly, and many of his reports were wry, stated that his faculty, quote, had formally indicated they were capable of walking from Swift as far as the tennis courts, and he was confident they could also make it to Stagg Field without serious hardship. The results were unanimous, and those who had favored Stagg Field from the start as a site, including President Beadle, displayed commendable restraint at the result, said Fussler. Now, Stagg Field had for some time been looked as usable ground for university add-ons. Indeed, at one point, it was planned to take in the dormitory that would become known as Woodward Court. Eero Saarinen, the university architect, again during this period, drew up this version of high and low-rise dormitories that would have covered most of the site. But Woodward went to Woodlawn Avenue and to an uncertain future, and Stagg Field remained ripe for the plucking. There you can see on the left the famous west stands, and on the right is seen looking to the east. This area, equal in size to 1/2 of the entire old quadrangles, which contained more than 24 buildings, housed just the athletic field, Bartlett, and some outbuildings. It was too far from the labs and medical school for a science library, but that would be taken care of later. Now, with broad program, and here you see the site from the air and Regenstein superimposed on it, with program and site settled, the physical planning could get serious and detailed schematics prepared. During the 1963-4 period, Fuster worked almost continuously with a special faculty library committee appointed to review plans, which met every week or so for 2 months, for more than that actually, as well as with the library board. It was a model of interactive consultation. At the faculty committee's first meeting, which was March 12, 1963, and this in essence is the beginning, an extended and quite lively session, Fuster, along with 5 members from SOM, attended with library staff, President Beadle, Provost Levy, and 10 articulate and talkative faculty. Fuster outlined the preliminary programming and secured endorsement for his basic positions, the assumptions underlying this building. First, that there would be 2 central libraries with a separate science library to be constructed after the Humanities Social Science building. The science library was tentatively scheduled for 58th and Ellis. Second, Fuster argued that the new building should be layered horizontally. Subject-oriented reading rooms, bibliographers, and service facilities located on each floor adjacent to but outside the relevant stacks. 2 versions, early and late, of one of these floors just presented to you. The alternative, of course, would have been a vertical arrangement, grouping most services on just 1 or 2 floors with a major reading room and placing the book stacks above them. The committee made some minor adjustments, accepting a structure which would house general reference and bibliography on the first floor with a small general book stack adjacent to retain vertical flow in the stack, and from 4 to 6 subject-oriented reading and service areas distributed throughout the building, related to the book collections on each stack floor, but limited in scale. Third, Fuster argued for dramatically separating study facilities from book stacks, partly to control the movement of books through this enormous building. This position reversed a long-standing trend within American university libraries of inserting more study space within the book stack, a process which had been ongoing certainly since the construction of Widener half a century earlier. This was a controversial position and provoked lots of continuing debate. Fuster argued its advantages were multiple. It permitted a lower stack temperature, inhibiting the physical deterioration of book paper. It would reduce unnecessary traffic in and out of the stacks. It would, in the dedicated reader areas, promote group identity among graduate students. And with charging areas outside each stack floor and effective entry controls, it would prevent books from being dispersed uncharged throughout the building, a common anxiety. It's impossible to overestimate, by the way, concerns about book security and controls expressed both by faculty and librarians during this period. Some pointed out that the heaviest users, faculty working from their studies, would be the most distant from the stacks. There were those who wanted more study desks and even carrels within the stacks, and who argued against the lockable shelves that Herman Fuster favored in the reading areas, lest too many books be removed uncharged from circulation. While Fuster insisted lockable shelves be provided, he said students had to have a place for their typewriters, their clothing, and so on, he did not want to see any assigned seating or study spaces for student researchers. In the end, the consultation desks placed along the stack perimeters, which did not take space away from the stacks themselves, seemed to meet the need, and several faculty votes indicated that they would accept this larger scheme. On the whole, the stack was viewed then as a space in which to browse, obtain books, charge them, and then leave for studies or reading tables. The subject reading rooms were for bibliographic and limited research support. But in another response to faculty arguments, enclosed rooms for groups of 12 to 15 to work in within the reading areas created potential seminar or classrooms. Finally, and this was all presented at this meeting, Fuster argued that the new library must encourage experiment. I'll show you another floor, even while allowing that a functioning institution had to meet most existing conventions. It's interesting reading the meeting notes to see that Provost Edward Levy not only endorsed experimentation, but declared the Fuster plan to be more conventional than he had expected, suggesting fresher approaches technologically oriented. Mr. Levy observed it might be possible to put the card catalog and many of the books on tape and provide through the building places at which the catalog or the books could be read through closed-circuit television and other devices. 1963 is 42 years ago, decades ahead of the computer advances which would transform the library as we know it. And some of the librarians were skeptical about the degree of basic transformations, but Provost Levy's comments suggest a vision, an uncanny vision perhaps, of today's library and a suggestive parallel with our own planning. The response of Herman Foster and his library colleagues was that they expected traditional library uses to coexist with changes still unborn. Actually, Edward Levy pressed quite hard, indicating disappointment with the response, hoping, quote, that the library will be like a good hospital, always experimenting, always seeking new and improved techniques. In the end, though some faculty continued to urge more study desks within the stacks, they accepted extramural facilities so long as they would be private and pleasant. Others still continued to worry about the loss of disciplinary identity fostered by Harper's special rooms. I cannot summarize, under time constraints obviously, in more detail the minutes of these meetings with the faculty. They are really fascinating in revealing the decision-making process. But I reiterate that every part of this building was scrutinized, debated, and not set aside until some kind of consensus had been reached. In May 1965, 2 years after this first meeting, and after final plans had been drawn, Foster invited librarians from Cornell, Michigan, and Harvard, Stephen McCarthy, Frederick Wagman, and Douglas Bryant, to a Chicago meeting, imploring them to critique his approach and the entire building. He requested a second report from Stephen McCarthy of Cornell, fearing that McCarthy had pulled some punches in his letter out of courtesy. McCarthy responded with a thoroughgoing critique of the plan, suggesting 3 more floors. Next, she wrote, "will kill me for this one," and a cube-like structure to replace the lopsided triangle that he said had been designed. "You may be sorry you asked the question," he wrote Foster, "and if you are, just tear this up." The surviving copy indicates this didn't happen, but McCarthy's suggestions did come to naught. Nevertheless, a special faculty subcommittee was created to encourage continuing debate. I might note that all this activity occurred within a strange vacuum. There was no money yet for the new library. One $500,000 grant for planning, principally to pay the architects for their time, was received in 1963 from the Skirmahorn Trust, achieved through the intervention of Florence Miller, George Pullman's granddaughter, some of you may recall, who lived here in Hyde Park for many years. A library plaque on the first floor honors the event. Without that, there would have been nothing. Library planning developed alongside a rhetorical campaign to define themes that might attract potential donors, though again, who they would be, no one was sure. Now, the planning proceeded with many questions, some of which time has transcended. Where would smoking be allowed? How would the noise of typewriters be cushioned if students or faculty used them for note-taking? Would checking books out on each floor distract from reader concentration? How cold should the stacks be? Would this discourage browsing? Did we need a full-service canteen? How large should the reference collections be on each of the subject-themed floors? Would this arrangement encourage student identity? What sized reading tables were best, round or rectangular? And were dividers appropriate for reader territoriality? How would the floors, particularly the first floor, be covered? Carpeting was meant to soften noise, then enhance physical appearance, but old-timers will remember the highly visible damage inflicted on that solid color carpeting by just 1 or 2 Chicago winters. How would current serials be housed? In one single supervised section or divided with one concentration but others on various floors? Would art and music enter the main library? What about the reading terraces? Should there be a north entrance? On and on and on. Nothing is perfect, and some problems resulted as much from faculty intransigence as from library aspiration. The architectural details of the building itself should be left, I think, to another time. Given its size, by far the largest building on campus, the architect sought to break up the mass and set it back from bordering streets. However useful an aesthetic and even symbolic decision, this would vastly complicate later efforts to develop the North Campus and almost irretrievably challenge the quadrangular scheme which had been the basis for the old campus. But within months, a plan was arrived at, the only aspect of which, as you can see from some of these, particularly the one on the upper left, from some of these drawings being the north and south fenestration. And you can see the view from the north to the left, the view from the south below, and two final contrasts. The drawing on the left shows the fenestration not yet quite worked out, if you will, but it eventually would be worked out. What remained was the money. This was no little thing. The tentative cost of the building by early 1964 worked out to be $17 million. It would actually be slightly more, close to $20 million. This was a huge sum at the time. By CPI calculations, in today's dollars, $130 million, and probably even more given construction costs. For a while, suggestions were made to reduce the size of the structure or divest it of certain functions. These were ultimately rejected. A major request to a New York foundation in 1964, which was divesting its assets, resulted in a rather curt turndown. There were continuing discussions of possible donors or honorees who might inspire donors, a large list ranging from General Wood of Sears Roebuck and Paul Mellon to Cyrus Eaton, Henry Rennery, and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. Nothing came of all this. All that had been accomplished after several years of work was the planning grant of $500,000 and contributions totaling $80,000, just $16,920,000 to go by the end of 1964. But then, miraculously, on October 22nd, 1965, 20 days after the university launched its three-year, $160 million campaign, the Regenstein Foundation, impressed by the plans, awarded a $10 million gift for the building. 2 weeks later, amid press conferences and other publicity measures, the university presented its plans, along with pictures of the new baby, with appropriate fanfare to the public. And from left to right, that is Gaylord Donnelly, Joseph Regenstein, and George Beadle, and Herman Fussler is kneeling and pointing to the image. Some 7 months later, in June 1966, a $3.5 million grant from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare completed the major funding for the building. After more than 75 years of debate and frustration, the University of Chicago would get a well-planned central research library, consolidating most collections onto one site and creating the basis for our present discussions. And this is where I end. It is dangerous to try to distill a complex history into principles of action, but I have a few for whatever they're worth. Regenstein has been, I think, a considerable success. What can we imitate? First, we need a single overall planner for this project, librarian or otherwise, with a compelling vision for what needs to be done and a willingness to accept responsibility for action. Secondly, we need to involve the users during the planning, involve them continuously, creatively, and proactively. Third, we need to invite expertise of all kinds in the interests of making informed judgments, requesting professional criticism, which Herman Fussler did, as I pointed out, right to the end, and be willing to adapt or intelligently refute it. And finally, we must be prepared to take risks in the interest of achieving the goal. Remember, this library was essentially completed as a detailed plan before the funds were there. It was needed, so it would be built. Our task, in a strange way, is reversed. We have the commitment. What precisely is it, particularly for this building, that we're going to need? I think we have made a very good start in reflecting on our problem. It's now the execution which will count. Thank you very much.